The Biden administration has spent 2 years turning its back on the proven tools and policies that Republicans use to strengthen our southern border. 2 years of a functionally open borders policy from Washington Democrats, and 2 years of chaos and suffering as a result. Last week, Customs and Border Protection announced that an already record-breaking year ended on a particularly catastrophic note. Illegal immigration apprehensions clocked at an all-time high of more than 2.7 million during the last fiscal year, by far the highest annual total ever recorded. But then December set an astonishing record all by itself at over 250,000 apprehensions. Last month was CBP's busiest month ever recorded. The American people are outraged at this willful failure. They rate immigration and border as one of the single biggest problems facing our country, second only to the economy. Two-thirds of the country disapprove of President Biden's handling of immigration and the border. That's a 67% supermajority of Americans who believe this administration is failing on border security. Now, our Democratic friends tie themselves in knots, making excuses for why they can't simply do their job, enforce federal law, and secure our border. Their far-left base makes them pretend that we can't enforce the laws on the books unless we find new ways to be even more generous to people who come here illegally. It's nonsensical. Every local official who belongs to the Democratic Party are rapidly losing patience with the Biden administration's border incompetence. The Democratic mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has spent months sounding the alarm on the catastrophic effects of this administration's functionally open borders. He said this is a national crisis. He said, quote, "There's no more room." He said, "There's no more room in New York." Yet the far left attacks him, the mayor of New York, for pointing out the problem. The Democratic governor of Colorado is taking a cue from Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis and arranging transportation for illegal immigrants to various liberal jurisdictions that have self-identified as so-called sanctuary cities. This is a growing bipartisan chorus that is begging President Biden to do his job and secure our nation. It doesn't take any new laws. It doesn't take some new grand bargain or amnesty. The administration just needs to do its job, secure the border, and let law enforcement enforce our laws. The Biden administration has all the tools and authorities it needs to tackle the crisis, if a solution were actually what they were after. Later today, the Speaker of the House and the President will begin bipartisan discussions about the future trajectory of our government's borrowing and spending. It is right, appropriate, and entirely normal that our need to raise the debt limit would be paired with negotiations regarding Democrats' runaway printing and spending. The American people changed control of the House because the voters wanted to constrain Democrats' runaway, reckless party-line spending. The voters of this country looked at the trillions of dollars of party-line spending, the runaway inflation, and the mountain of debt. And last November, they hit the brakes. We just experienced 2 years when Washington Democrats got to set policy without negotiating, and the American people put an end to it. Some Democrats are trying to rewrite history and pretend that Republican demands for negotiations are unusual, but that, of course, is just false. Back in 2017, the Senate Democratic leader said the debt ceiling gave Democrats, quote, leverage in broader talks. As the New York Times explained back in 2017, then Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leader, quote, began formulating a plan to apply pressure, jettisoning the idea of backing a straightforward or clean debt limit measure as a way to gain muscle in coming negotiations. That was the Pelosi-Schumer playbook for the debt limit, demand negotiations. Here's how the Democratic leader put it himself at the time. He said the debt ceiling, quote, gives another ample opportunity for bipartisanship, not for one party jamming its choices down the throats of the other. So I trust Democrats will be consistent with their past positions, and the White House will waste no time beginning the customary bipartisan negotiations with the new Republican majority over in the House. The President of the United States does not get to walk away from the table. The same president who happily signed off on trillions of dollars of needless party line spending needs to begin good faith negotiations on spending reform with Speaker McCarthy, and do it today. Now, on a related matter, there are lots of egregious ways that President Biden has wasted taxpayer money trying to buy up his low approval ratings. But the Democrats' proposal for student loan socialism is really one of the worst. It's like the Democrats paid scientists in a lab to invent the most unfair government handout that could possibly exist. Democrats want to take the graduate school loans of doctors and lawyers and white-collar professionals making six figures and put their debt on the shoulders of Americans who didn't take out loans at all. To the middle-class families who saved and sacrificed and skipped vacations to pay for more of their kids' college, the Democrats want to turn you into suckers. To the plumbers, firefighters, checkout clerks, and auto mechanics who made career choices to avoid taking on debt, the Democrats think the dentists and lawyers deserve extra handouts at your expense. To the patriots who volunteered to serve our nation in uniform as part of a plan to attend college debt-free, the Democrats want to change the rules behind your back. President Biden and his party wake up every day looking for ways to transfer money and power away from the working class toward elites. But even for today's Democratic Party, this one is especially galling. This is reverse Robin Hood policy. Democrats stealing from the working class to reward people who are comparatively better off. It just isn't fair on a personal level. It's also staggeringly reckless fiscal policy. Remember, this whole undertaking was first set up as a short-term emergency measure at the very start of COVID. Those earliest weeks when the entire economy seemed to be in a free fall. That was almost 3 years ago. So shortly afterwards, thanks to the Bipartisan CARES Act that came out of the Republican-led Senate, the economy rebounded. Household savings actually went up. Many white-collar professionals spent months, if not years, working remotely from the comfort of their living rooms. Any legitimate reason for pausing loan payments evaporated just a few months after it began. But the Democrats have kept it going year after year. Now they want to magically wave away people's debts altogether. Needless to say, this would be enormously expensive for the country. If you add up the cost of three things, the nearly 3-year-long pause thus far, the mass jubilee the Biden administration is trying to defend in court, and the Democrats' proposal to turn the income-driven payment program into permanent socialism, the total cost of these three measures is projected to hit $1 trillion. $1 trillion. This estimate is from our colleague, Senator Cassidy, who is shining a bright spotlight on these terrible policies as the incoming ranking member of the Help Committee. On top of all the reckless inflationary spending that Democrats have pushed through, They want to redistribute up to another $1 trillion away from working-class Americans toward college-educated people who already earn higher salaries on average. The Democrats want to squeeze even more money out of cashiers, welders, first responders, janitors, and cosmetologists, and send it to a group of people who already out-earn those people on an average basis. More reckless spending, more debt and inflation, and no fairness for American families.
Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
This evening, President Biden will begin the back half of his term with a State of the Union address to Congress and to the American people. But the White House attempts to script the message for this week have been upset by recent events. Over the last several days, the country learned that on President Biden's watch, the state of our union is apparently under Chinese surveillance from our own skies. It's ludicrous to suggest that Canada and the United States had no choice but to let this thing traipse across the continent from coast to coast. President Obama's own Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, says, quote, "We should have acted earlier." The administration's hand-wringing and indecision, finally downing the balloon only after it had toured the length of our country, was typical of how President Biden and his team have conducted our foreign affairs. Our top military commanders and civilian experts all say that our broader strategic competition with China is our most serious challenge. But this president's last budget request tried to cut funding for our military after inflation, while Beijing keeps investing in their own capabilities. The commander of our U.S. Strategic Command just told Congress that China now has more land-based intercontinental ballistic missile launchers than we do. The administration's reckless retreat from Afghanistan blew past the expert warnings, cost the lives of 13 American service members, let thousands of terrorists waltz out of prison, and incentivized others to challenge an America that looked cowardly. In hesitating, indecisive, self-deterred approach to helping Ukraine before Putin invaded, and the earliest days right afterwards left freedom's friends flat-footed and are making the subsequent fight more difficult than it ever had to be. And now the Biden administration has apparently pivoted from chasing another bad nuclear deal with Iran to trying to let terrorists out of Guantanamo Bay. These are just some of the reasons why 41% of Americans say the state of our union is weak, and only 13% say it's strong. Of course, this administration has also created problems for American families closer to home. A nationwide poll published last week revealed that just 16% of Americans say they're in a better financial situation today than they were 2 years ago when the president and his party assumed total control of government. For 84% of Americans, one-party Democratic control of Washington either failed to live up to its promises or actively made life worse. 2 years ago, over the objections of their own party's top economists, Washington Democrats misinterpreted a narrow election victory as a mandate for an unprecedented spending spree. When President Biden took office, inflation was at 1.4%. From Inauguration Day to today, inflation's over 13%. Working families have seen grocery prices jump 18.6%, used car prices rise 26.2%, and energy prices soar by 33.9%. Millions of Americans have earned pay raises at work, but runaway inflation has left them with less purchasing power than before. Our southern border is in crisis, shattering all-time records for illegal immigrant apprehensions. Streets and neighborhoods are being swallowed up by violent crime after local Democrats have cut police budgets, liberal prosecutors have turned jails into revolving doors, and national Democrats spent years amplifying the kinds of anti-police rhetoric that result in more crime. And President Biden is helping the radical left go on offense and bring a culture war to the doorsteps of normal American families, trying to squeeze Catholic hospitals and faith-based daycares out of business, trying to take school choice and curriculum transparency away from parents, and on and on and on. President Biden campaigned on being the adult in the room, but he's not even calling the shots in his own party. Over and over on issue after issue, this president has handed the car keys to the radical left and turned himself into a passenger. That's why working families across the country have voted for change. They elected a Republican majority in the House of Representatives to put the emergency brakes on runaway liberal spending. They re-elected all-star Republican governors in places like Texas, Georgia, and Florida. And they elevated a talented new generation of leaders, including the youngest serving governor in America, Governor Sanders of Arkansas, whom the American people will hear from tonight. Our country may still be struggling to understand what on earth Washington Democrats think they've actually accomplished in the past 2 years, but they can be absolutely sure where Republicans stand. Now, one final matter. January was the 21st month in a row with year-on-year inflation of at least 5%. The U.S. economy has seen prices rising at an annual rate of 5% or more every single month following President Biden's first 100 days. Democrats' reckless spending has made soaring costs a fixture of everyday life for families all across our country. Real wage declines have become a tragic reality for workers in every single state. Last week, new data proved yet again that persistent inflation has become actually embedded in our economy. One key measure of consumer behavior, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, grew at triple the monthly rate from December and at its fastest pace since June of last year. Inflation in the services sector in particular is 5.7% higher than it was a year ago. The Democrats' inflation is not just driving up the prices for groceries and essentials that families pay themselves at the checkout counter, it's also baked into the cost families pay indirectly through service providers, from plumbers to contractors to medical providers and beyond. In every corner of the economy, workers and businesses are still having to hunker down against the ongoing consequences of Democrats' reckless mistakes. What an odd time, then, for the Biden administration to declare victory over a problem it helped actually create. The White House press secretary declared earlier this month that the president's economic plan is indeed working. Well, today, 57% of Americans say they have less money in their pocket than they did a year ago. Nearly 2/3 say they're living paycheck to paycheck. The White House calls this mission accomplished. The American people call it a nightmare for 2 years and counting. Mr. President.
Minority Leader.
For over 2 years, the Biden administration has failed to attend to some of the most basic governing duties: stable prices, secure borders, and safe streets are three of the most fundamental responsibilities that any government owes its people. But Washington Democrats neglected the basics for their pet priorities. They spent trillions of dollars on government goodies that nobody asked for, triggered the worst inflation in 40 years, and turned a blind eye to the border crisis and a crime wave, all occurring on their watch. They caused the damage on party line votes without any input from the Republican side. In response, the American people flipped the House and chose a closely divided Senate. The voters dialed up the checks and the balances. The people went to the ballot box and demanded the Democrats start negotiating and compromising. But the president's refusing to engage. Even as his own advisors say the debt ceiling is approaching fast, the White House is totally MIA. His position has been no negotiation, no reforms. It's such an absurd position that even fellow Democrats are not buying it. The senior senator from West Virginia, a Democrat, has publicly called on the president to sit down with Speaker McCarthy and negotiate. And listen to House Democrats. Get to work. Get it done for the sake of the country, says one. They've got to do it soon, says another. Just a few years ago, the Democratic leader said debt limit talks were, quote, an opportunity for bipartisanship. And what about President Biden himself? Here's what then Vice President Biden said about the debt ceiling back in 2011. Some of them are still unwilling to budge, taking an absolute position. My way or no way. That's not governing, said the vice president in 2011. My goodness, that's harsh criticism for the 2023 version of President Biden from the 2011 version of Vice President Biden. The Democrats' reckless policies have already dealt far too much damage to our country. This administration's inflation has hammered working families' budgets. Their anti-energy policies have raised gas prices and utility bills. Their attempt to reinvent cash welfare without work requirements hurt small businesses by worsening labor shortages and hurt families by promoting dependence. So the working people of this country have already paid a heavy enough price for Democrat failures. We should not even come within a mile of flirting with a Democratic debt default on top of all the rest. It's time for President Biden to stop the partisan stubbornness, join Speaker McCarthy at the grown-up table, and get talking. I suggest that was a quorum.
Republican leader.
7 of the last 10 debt limit increases were attached to bipartisan government spending deals. All 3 of the debt limit increases from 2017 through 2020 were attached to bipartisan government spending deals. So there's no reason why our country should be drifting toward crisis. The solution is clear. It's been clear for months. President Biden needs to negotiate on spending with Speaker McCarthy. The Speaker's been at the table since February. House Republicans are the only people in town who have passed any bill that prevents default. President Biden has been MIA. House and Senate Democrats have no plan, no proposal. They have no bill to raise the debt ceiling that could pass either the House or the Senate, let alone both. So the choice is President Biden's. Either he drives the country into default or he comes to the table. 4 years ago, in 2019, the roles were reversed. Republicans held the White House. Democrats held the House. I was the majority leader. My advice to the president then was the same as my advice to the president now. Raise the debt limit by negotiating spending levels with the Speaker. That administration listened. They sent Secretary Mnuchin to hammer out a caps deal with Speaker Pelosi. They struck a compromise. Spending levels were set, and the debt limit was raised. That's what a responsible Senate Majority Leader would be telling the Biden White House today. Sit down with the Speaker, strike a deal. Any compromise fleshed out by the Republican House and the Democratic White House will pass the Senate easily. So President Biden's actions will either prevent default or guarantee default. It's just that simple. It's up to the president. Either President Biden causes an economic disaster of his own creation, or he picks up the 2019 playbook and negotiates with Speaker McCarthy. Everybody knows this is on President Biden. Rank and file House and Senate Democrats have publicly called on the White House to negotiate. The Washington Post ran an entire editorial entitled, "It's Time for Biden to Call McCarthy." Last week, an entire news story detailed how the White House is garnering no support from nonpartisan leaders or experts for their bizarre strategy of sleepwalking into disaster. The people around President Biden, including the Senate Democratic leader, seem to think that they can wish away the results of the midterm election. They want to pretend the American people didn't flip the House. That's not how it works. In divided government, you negotiate. The president and the speaker need to talk, just like in 2019. We need a bipartisan spending agreement, just like 7 of the previous 10 debt limit deals. I'll be joining the White House meeting later today, and I'll continue to support the speaker. Senate Democrats continue to dutifully advance the Biden administration's radical nominees. This week, the Senate will decide whether to give yet another left-wing lawyer a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. Natasha Murrell is an activist lawyer with a penchant for staking out extreme and inflammatory positions that are thoroughly divorced from reality. For example, she attacked widely popular election integrity measures, claiming, quote, "It's inconsistent to denounce white supremacy but not repudiate voter ID laws." Alongside the self-proclaimed wild-eyed leftist, Democrats just confirmed to the bench last week, Ms. Murrell went after the state of Alabama for daring to verify the identities of people who cast ballots in elections. Meanwhile, Ms. Murrell has found time to attack what she calls unfounded yet repeated public assertions that there's widespread lack of respect for law enforcement and criticize efforts to promote law and order as, quote, an illegal attempt to advance a false narrative that law enforcement was being attacked. Well, Madam President, President Biden's first year in office saw the largest number of law enforcement deaths in the line of duty in 20 years. But Ms. Murrell doesn't appear to like grappling with facts that don't suit her narrative. Normally, a record like this would be shockingly disqualifying. But under the Biden administration, it's not an outlier, it's an essential qualification. Unfortunately, the president's affinity for radical nominees applies to folks already on the job as well. Last week, Democrats on the EPW committee ran through the nomination of Jeffrey Barron to another term as commissioner at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Mr. Barron already has an extensive record as the NRC's resident liberal obstructionist. While his colleagues collaborate on regulatory frameworks that encourage safe and efficient energy production, this nominee prides himself on being a stick in the mud. Even leading climate activists understand that Mr. Barron's dedication to hindering nuclear development harms the environment in the process. They know that reducing carbon emissions means embracing safe nuclear energy. Mr. Barron, however, does not. At every opportunity, this nominee has opposed common sense efforts to revise regulations and keep pace with the smaller and more affordable nuclear technologies of the future. He's shown that his blanket anti-nuclear approach is both a tired relic and an active obstruction to American prosperity. So no wonder even some Senate Democrats are thinking twice about rubber stamping Mr. Barron's nomination. I'd urge each of our colleagues to oppose it. Now, on one final matter, across the country, the end of summer gave working families gas prices near all-time highs, beyond just a seasonal swing. Last week, Washington Democrats opened a new front in their war on affordable and abundant American energy. The Biden administration announced the withdrawal of more than 13 million acres in the National Petroleum Reserve from oil and gas leasing and canceled 7 oil and gas leases in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The president calls this move a necessary step to meet the urgency of the climate crisis. But any serious observer would call it bad news for families trying to make ends meet. Last fiscal year, under President Biden's stranglehold, the number of new federal acres leased plummeted. Comparing the first 30 months of each administration, onshore leasing is down from 67 sales under the previous administration to a mere 9 sales under President Biden. From 67 sales down to 9 in this administration. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has led a 5-year plan for offshore energy production required by law to expire over a year ago with no new plan in sight. In other words, there are no new offshore energy leases in the hopper. Now Congress has exercised its authority and forced the president to reinstate an offshore lease it had already canceled, but in response, his administration put 6 million acres of the sale off limits to oil and gas exploration. And Senate Democrats have been more than willing to toe the party line. Last year, every single one of our Democratic colleagues voted against Senator Barrasso's effort to require dependable onshore leasing. And every single one voted against Senator Kennedy's measure to restore certainty to offshore leasing. So freezing the development of clean and reliable energy here at home does nothing more than kick production of more expensive and less reliable fuels into overdrive overseas. You can guarantee fuels won't be climate conscious or environmentally sound when they come from hostile regimes overseas. The cost of Washington Democrats' short-sighted obsession is measured in higher costs at the pump, higher home heating and cooling bills, and greater reliance on foreign energy. But outsourcing our energy policy to the radical environmentalists, the Biden administration is is literally outsourcing America's energy security. Our nation really deserves better. On an entirely different matter, in a speech last month, President Biden claimed that American wages were growing faster than inflation. That's Bidenomics. Unfortunately, for working families, the truth of Bidenomics is quite the opposite. Even as nominal wages continue to rise, inflation is actually rising faster. For the third straight year, real median household income is declining. According to the Census Bureau, inflation-adjusted income declined last year, listen to this, last year alone by $1,750. In other words, Washington Democrats' historic inflation has swallowed the gains of a tight labor market and stuck workers across the country with a massive pay cut. Worst of all, the Bidenomics tax is hitting low-income workers the hardest. The wealthiest 5% of households are earning 4.1% less than they were 4 years ago. But listen to this, but the poorest 10% are earning 6.3% less, and wage gains for manufacturing workers are lagging even further behind those of other industries. One contract worker in Michigan said of his job at the hardware store, quote, "Every time my wage goes up, the price of everything else goes up, and it does me no good." And that the price of some construction materials are only beginning to come down by cents when they need to come up dollars. So, Mr. President, that's Bidenomics, and working Americans have every reason to be sick of it. Now, on another matter, the Biden administration announced yesterday it is seeking new recruits in its war on affordable and reliable American energy to fill the ranks of a new program called American Climate Corps. While the administration works overtime to freeze sensible development like energy pipelines, its latest initiative would essentially set up a taxpayer-funded pipeline for turning climate activists into climate bureaucrats. Now, President Biden's nostalgia for FDR's New Deal is already well documented. So setting aside the absurdity of Washington Democrats' fixation with the Green New Deal, it would be hard to imagine an economic moment less well suited to a new Depression-era work program. This isn't the early 1930s, when the American people were up against high unemployment and low inflation. In fact, what a Democrats' runaway spending has dumped on working families today is just the opposite. For 2 years now, we've seen historic inflation and a record labor shortage. This is such a profoundly tone-deaf idea, it couldn't even earn the support of the president's own party here in the Senate, during votes on Democrats' so-called Inflation Reduction Act last year. Not a single one of our colleagues joined Senator Sanders in voting for his amendment to create a climate work project on the taxpayer's dime. Apparently, that hasn't deterred President Biden or the left-wing activists behind the wheel of his administration's energy policies. As working families struggle to afford gas, electricity, and groceries, the advice from wealthy blue state liberals is apparently to shell out for an expensive electric car and foot the bill for the so-called climate corps. There's no Hoover Dam or Lincoln Tunnel on the other side of this nonsense spending. Just Potemkin jobs and a new make-work program when there's plenty of work to go around. So, Mr. President, activists are calling it climate justice, but it doesn't sound like justice to the working families just trying to get by on President Biden's watch. Yesterday, the Senate took the first step toward avoiding a harmful and unnecessary government shutdown. The business before us now is to pass a standard short-term funding legislation to keep basic and essential government functions operating while work continues on full-year appropriations. We're talking about making sure that the service members who will continue to stand watch around the world, and the Border Patrol and ICE agents who will continue to contend with the Biden administration's border crisis here at home, and the VA medical providers who will continue to care for America's heroes don't have to go without their paychecks. The choice facing Congress, pretty straightforward. We can take the standard approach and fund the government for 6 weeks at the current rate of operations, or we can shut the government down in exchange for a zero meaningful progress on policy. So let's be clear. There are a number of important discussions on additional funding priorities that are still unresolved. Many colleagues are eager to make real progress in bringing the Democrats' reckless spending to heel, to force the administration to start taking its southern border crisis seriously, to provide greater relief for victims of wildfires, hurricanes, and other natural disasters, and to deliver continued assistance to Ukraine's defense against Russia. And on all of those counts, I'm one of them. We'd like to address all of those issues. But these important discussions cannot progress if Congress simply fails to complete our work on standard short-term funding, and the basic functions of government end up being taken hostage. So, Mr. President, a vote against a standard short-term funding measure is a vote against paying over $1 billion in salary for Border Patrol and ICE agents working to track down lethal fentanyl and tame our open borders, letting FEMA's disaster relief fund dry up is not a productive way to advocate for victims of disasters. Letting small businesses' loan applications collect dust is not a productive way to help working Americans contend with Washington Democrats' historic inflation. Shutting down the government isn't an effective way to make a point. Keeping it open is the only way to make a difference on the most important issues we are facing. Now, on another matter, the American people are absolutely sick and tired of living under Bidenomics. According to one recent survey, nearly 70% of Americans think the economy is actually getting worse, and support for President Biden's handling of the economy is at the lowest level of his presidency. It might have something to do with the fact that since President Biden took office, soaring inflation has turned rising wages into net pay cuts for American workers. Real wages are down 2.3% since 2021. Household incomes fell in 17 states last year, and for all but the wealthiest 20% of households, American families' savings have actually shrunk. A food truck owner in Atlanta told reporters recently that he is paying, listen to this, 25% more for ingredients, while the lines for his sandwiches are dwindling as customers cut back on their spending. Here's what he said. I've had to raise some of my prices just to kind of keep up, to make it. And gas prices, when you drive a food truck, you only get 8 miles a gallon. So the cost of my fuel really hurts. Here's what the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, said last week. People hate inflation. Hate it. Well, the chairman of the Fed is absolutely right. Working families are tired of wondering how to make ends meet every month. They're tired of being told that Bidenomics is working for them.
Without objection.
I'd like to begin today by welcoming our newest colleague, Senator LaFonza Butler of California. As the Senate continues to mourn our late friend and colleague, Dianne Feinstein, I know the people of California are grateful for Senator Butler's willingness to serve, and I know our colleagues join me in welcoming her. Now, on another matter, last week the Senate voted to prevent a domestic budget dispute from shutting down the federal government. Now, with straightforward, short-term funding in place, it's time for Congress to redouble our effort on a number of unfinished priorities. In the coming weeks, the Senate needs to continue making progress on full-year appropriations, and we'll begin by funding important resources for military construction, veteran services, agriculture, housing, and transportation infrastructure. But our work does not stop there. The Senate also needs to address urgent supplemental funding needs and continue our work to bring the Biden administration's reckless spending and radical regulations to heel. Many of our colleagues are particularly keen to deliver additional relief to communities rebuilding after devastating natural disasters, from hurricanes on the Gulf Coast to wildfires in Hawaii to flooding in Kentucky. Bipartisan majorities in both chambers continue to recognize that providing additional lethal assistance to Ukraine's defense against Russia's aggression is in the United States' direct interest. Across the country, as historic inflation continues to wreck household budgets, millions of working families are ready to turn the page on Bidenomics. And after 3 record-setting years of functionally open borders, folks in every state are eager for Congress to force the Biden administration to start cleaning up the southern border crisis. The fiscal year that just ended saw apprehensions at the southern border exceed 2 million for only the second time in history. The first time was just last year. Some reports expect that the last month's total could clock in as the highest on record. On President Biden's watch, illegal border crossings and asylum claims have stretched the Border Patrol and ICE personnel to their breaking point. Authorities are seizing hundreds of millions of lethal doses of fentanyl, though they also estimate that they're apprehending just a fraction, roughly a quarter of all the fentanyl that's smuggled at the border. Frankly, Mr. President, this is less about providing border personnel with new resources than it is about giving them the authority and direction to actually enforce the law. It's certainly not about bailing out blue state sanctuary cities while the tsunami of illegal immigration continues unabated. It's about the administration finally taking common sense steps to end their wrong-headed policies that have encouraged illegal immigrants to cross our borders in the first place. Every state is now a border state. Major cities like New York and Chicago are being overwhelmed by arrivals from the southern border. Finally, even blue state mayors and governors are joining the chorus, calling out the administration for its utter failure on border security. Of course, across the country, liberal local governments and innocent residents are also facing the consequences of years of soft-on-crime policies, and once again, our nation's capital leads the headlines. Just last night, for example, Congressman Henry Cuellar was the victim of a violent carjacking a few blocks from the Capitol building. Armed assailants threatened him at gunpoint and stole his car. Thankfully, our House colleague was not injured, and his car has been recovered. It's not even the first time this year that a member of Congress has been assaulted while in town for work. But this is what private American citizens are facing every single day, like the 22,000 people who have had their cars stolen in Chicago this year, or the 20,000 victims of felony assault in New York City. This sort of brazen violence against anyone should be a wake-up call for local officials. Last year, a 55-year-old man was murdered at a gas station in Washington by a group of teenagers attempting to steal his car. The city is now averaging 2 carjackings every day, and these crimes are increasingly being committed by young people. Now, at a certain point, the American people who visit our nation's capital by the millions every year might expect the city's liberal government to finally start getting serious about securing the streets. But even as senseless violence increases, local leaders are bent on undermining public safety. One member of the D.C. Council, the same soft-on-crime panel that tried to weaken sentencing for repeat offenders earlier this year, proposed recently that local courts be required to provide a written explanation before releasing violent criminals before trial. The court's response: such a requirement was not feasible because it would significantly increase their workload. All this in a city where prosecutors declined to even prosecute 2/3 of the arrests last year. American families deserve to feel safe in their homes and their neighborhoods, and certainly in the nation's capital. It shouldn't take another assault or carjacking or homicide to convince left-wing local leaders. Over the weekend, the southern border crisis set a sobering new record. In the past year, CBP conducted more border apprehensions than in any year on record. Officials reported more than 2.4 million apprehensions since last October. And this number doesn't even count the illegal entries that actually evaded authorities. Most alarming, this news isn't actually new. Last year was the third straight year to set an all-time record for border apprehensions. In other words, every year that President Biden has been in charge of border security, his administration hasn't simply failed, it has failed to a historic and catastrophic degree. America has had functionally open borders for years. Along with millions of illegal aliens, we've allowed Chinese fentanyl and other lethal drugs to literally pour into our country, kill thousands of Americans every year. So Democrats' border crisis isn't new. What is new is their supposed desire to finally do something about it. Now that blue state mayors and governors are starting to feel the consequences of this catastrophic policy, the Biden administration says it now wants to take action. Of course, the administration's mostly just wants to throw money at the problem and at its friends in local government. Apparently, their preferred response to a border crisis is a blue state bailout. Meanwhile, a particularly dangerous consequence of the president's border crisis is making history of its own. In the past year, southern border apprehensions of individuals on the terror watch list broke an all-time record, a record that was just set the year before. Even President Biden's Department of Homeland Security has admitted in its 2024 Homeland Threat Assessment that, quote, record encounters of migrants arriving from a growing number of countries have complicated border and immigration security. The American people have watched the Biden administration spin their way into plenty of problems, but they haven't managed to spin their way out of a single one yet. Our country deserves real law enforcement and real borders. Border security is national security. And on that front, the Senate has a lot of work to do. On a related matter, in the coming days and weeks, the Senate will work urgently to address several major related threats to the American people, to our allies, and our interests at home and abroad. Mr. President, every day brings new harrowing details of the terrorist attacks of October the 7th, and we continue to learn more about the role Iran plays in aiding and abetting terror. Just yesterday, new reports indicated that hundreds of terrorists from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad traveled to Iran last month for specialized combat training with Tehran's murderous Quds Force. Of course, waiting for specific evidence of tactical involvement really misses the point. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terror. It spent decades supporting proxy terrorists who share their hatred for Israel and America precisely so Tehran can maintain plausible deniability. We cannot lose sight of this savage charade. Evil will continue to target the United States and our allies, whether we pay attention to it or not. And the threats our adversaries pose are all connected. Iran doesn't just underwrite terrorist attacks on Israel, it outfits Russia with drones to help kill Ukrainians. China doesn't just menace Taiwan, it helps Iran circumvent international sanctions by trading consumer goods for oil. And Russia isn't just pummeling a sovereign neighbor. It's joined China for joint naval exercises in the Sea of Japan, as well as off the coast of Alaska. Our adversaries' ambitions are not local. They've been showing us for years that they are determined to challenge American leadership, undermine our interests, and weaken our alliances. But on every front, the Biden administration's response has fallen short. The president was hesitant to deter Russia's aggression in the first place and has dithered about helping equip Ukraine to defeat it. He's prioritized engagement with China on climate policy over building resilient supply chains with trusted allies. And just listen to his administration's jaw-dropping naivete after 3 years of squandering leverage on Iran. In early October, the president's national security advisor wrote a self-congratulatory article assessing the administration's foreign policy. Here's some of what he said about the Middle East. Quote, "In the face of serious frictions, we have de-escalated crises in Gaza and restored direct diplomacy." He went on to quote, "U.S. troops were under regular attack in Iraq and Syria. Such attacks, at least for now, have largely stopped," end quote. Finally, he claimed that the president's approach, quote, "frees up resources for other global priorities and reduces the risk of new Middle East conflicts." Well, at least that was the account that went to print before 1,400 Israelis were murdered on a Saturday morning, and before Iran-backed terrorists injured 24 American service members in numerous attacks in Iraq and in Syria. The incongruity between the administration's spin and reality has since been scrubbed from the article online. But the Biden administration's naive approach to terror remains woefully inadequate to meet the growing threat of radical Islamic terrorism, from Afghanistan to Yemen to Iraq and the Levant and Sahel. Abandoning Afghanistan, obsessing about closing Guantanamo Bay, removing the Houthis' designation as a terrorist organization, turning the other cheek when terrorists attack Americans and our allies, squandering leverage over Iran. Weakness in one theater begets weakness in another. Now, on another matter, last week the NLRB released a particularly unsavory new installment in the Biden administration's mess of overregulation. The NLRB's new rule dramatically expands the legal definition of an employer-employee relationship, turning small business owners in a franchise setting into middle managers. By one outside estimate, this rule will increase costs for small businesses, national franchisors, and consumers, all while decreasing the availability of jobs and business ownership possibilities. It would subject more of America's economy to the whims of the left's big labor allies, and it would force national companies to choose between offering less support for small business owning franchises and accepting greater liability for the policies of individual branches. It's bad policy, whichever way you slice it. Apparently, that's the self-described most pro-union president in American history in action. Of course, the NLRB is just one example of how President Biden's radical nominees have led a campaign to drown the American economy in red tape. Since the day he took office, the president's war on affordable and reliable domestic energy has been driving up costs for working families. Last year, President Biden canceled 3 offshore oil and gas lease sales. This year, total U.S. oil production has fallen below the Department of Energy's predictions by 1.4 million barrels per day. And the administration's short-sightedness has left the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at its lowest level in 40 years. Blanket bans on developing America's abundant energy reserves have already taken their toll on everything from grocery prices to home heating costs. But Washington bureaucrats continue to dream up new ways to micromanage families' choices on everything from home appliances to light bulbs. By one estimate, the Biden administration's energy regulations will drive up gas furnace costs by nearly $500 and water heater costs by $2,600. New efficiency standards could cost households an extra $140 on lighting and another $200 on washing machines. And while working families contend with this administration's maze of red tape, the president's giving the architects behind it promotions. Recently, President Biden designated Laura Daniel Davis as acting Deputy Secretary of the Interior. As several of my colleagues have noted, Ms. Daniel Davis brings such an extreme record to the job that even a Democratic majority here in the Senate couldn't confirm her. For example, she's been a key player in the administration's efforts to curtail leasing on our nation's abundant reserves of oil and natural gas. Almost 3 years ago, President Biden handed the keys to his energy policy to the far left, and it shows. Working Americans are already struggling to contend with historic inflation and rising crime on the president's watch. The last thing they need is more of Washington Democrats' red tape. 44 years ago last week, shock troops chanting "Death to America" and "Death to Israel" led Iranian revolutionaries across Tehran, overran the U.S. Embassy, and took 66 Americans hostage for 444 days. Iran's war against America, the great Satan, and Israel, the little Satan, has continued ever since. The regime has supported Shia terrorists, Sunni terrorists, and secular terrorists. It's underwritten violence across the world. From the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut to the 1992 Israeli embassy bombing in Buenos Aires, to the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, to hundreds of attacks masterminded by Soleimani on U.S. forces in Iraq. Iran has invested its time and resources into cultivating the terrorists of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The Iranian regime bears responsibility for their savagery, and it's also responsible for more than 100 attacks on U.S. personnel and interests in Iraq and Syria just since President Biden took office. These attacks have spiked since October 7th. 2 weeks ago, an Iranian-made suicide drone hit a U.S. military barracks in Iraq. Thankfully, the drone's explosive payload failed to detonate. But the message it sent about the state of President Biden's deterrence of the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism was as clear as day. In recent weeks, U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have been targeted at least another 38 times with lethal force, and more than 40 service members have been injured. Let me say that again. Iran-backed terrorists have attacked U.S. forces at least 38 times since October 7th. U.S. personnel are, of course, not the only targets of Iranian war on Western influence in the Middle East. America's Arab allies have endured repeated attacks as well. This ongoing siege is not the behavior of an adversary that is being effectively deterred. And how we got here is no mystery. When the Biden administration took office, it rushed to restore a failed nuclear agreement with an Iranian regime that had long since proven it wasn't to be trusted. When Iran-backed Houthi rebels killed 3 people at an airport in UAE and aimed 2 ballistic missiles at its capital last year, the administration responded with silence. And in response to the latest wave of attacks on U.S. forces, the president authorized a strike on an ammunition facility. Secretary of State felt compelled to reiterate that, said, "We are not looking for conflict with Iran." So clearly, Iran is looking for conflict with us. The Iranian regime is working hard to kill Americans, undermine our influence, and sow chaos among our allies. And so far, you'd have to say they're succeeding. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad perpetrated the deadliest day of violence against Jews since the Holocaust. Hezbollah stands ready at Iran's behest to escalate this conflict into a 2-front war. And years of careful progress toward normalization of relations between Israel and more of its Arab neighbors has been stalled. Demanding that Israel cease fire against Hamas would lock in these gains for Iran. It would grant amnesty for both the terrorists and their sponsors. We have a responsibility to reject these demands, not just on behalf of our ally Israel, but because amnesty for terrorists would embolden the Iran-backed threats to U.S. interests in the region. As I've said before, effective deterrence requires both capabilities and credibility. It requires that a global superpower actually act like one. In practical terms, deterring Iran and its web of terrorists means meeting attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria with swift, lethal, and overwhelming military force. It means working with allies to deploy crippling economic sanctions and inhibit Iran's support for terror. And it means finally taking the advice I offered President Biden when he took office. Set aside the failed nuclear deal, work with Republicans, and build an Iran policy that can endure long after he leaves office. Well, good afternoon, everyone. President Biden and Secretary Yellen called me yesterday because obviously they know I'm generally sympathetic with a broad approach to the supplemental. I did make it clear to both of them that we have to have a credible solution to the wide open border in order to get a bill that includes all of the things that I think are important across the Senate floor. I hope they understood the message, so I'm giving it again today in case there's any confusion about how strongly we feel about this. What is our definition? Senator Lindsey Graham and James Langford are going to handle that for us. It includes both asylum and parole. We're talking about a change in policy, not sending money, for example, to New York or to Chicago. So we're very serious about this, and I think it will be difficult to get the package across the floor in the Senate without a credible border solution. On another matter, for 3 years, the Biden administration's radical climate agenda has laid siege to affordable American energy and American consumer choice. Slash development of abundant domestic energy reserves, soaring prices for gas and heating oil, and a thicket of new regulations from unelected bureaucrats, from construction permitting to home appliances. And as the president's policies made life harder for working Americans, prominent Democrats took the administration's green obsession on the road. Special climate envoy John Kerry went to China hoping to treat climate goals as a freestanding issue from our major strategic competition. Not surprisingly, the PRC saw things differently, and Chairman Xi stated publicly that China had no plans, none, to stop increasing its carbon emissions for at least another 7 years. Meanwhile, the governor of California took his own trip to Beijing and pledged to PRC officials that, quote, regardless of what happens nationally, subnationally, you have a partner in California. Well, Mr. President, they sure do. In fact, the supply chains for some of our coastal liberals' favorite green passions, like electric vehicles, run directly through China. Close to 75% of lithium batteries, as well as 70% of our cathodes and anodes required to produce these batteries, come from China. The PRC holds more than 50% of the processing and refining capacity for critical minerals like cobalt. By all relevant measures, the United States lags dangerously behind. But earlier this year, the Biden administration decided to make bringing these critical supply chains home even more difficult by waiving Buy American requirements, materials used to make electric vehicle chargers. Apparently, the administration is so desperate to force its radical climate agenda that it's willing to enrich America's single biggest strategic adversary to get there. Washington Democrats so badly want to force working Americans to drive blue states' millionaires' favorite electric cars that they're willing to cut communist China in on the profits. Fortunately, the Senate had an opportunity yesterday to set things straight. Thanks to the leadership of Senator Rubio, a bipartisan majority voted to block the Biden administration's waiver policy using the Congressional Review Act. Apparently, the president's radical climate agenda is too radical for several members of his own party. Hopefully, he'll listen to them soon. Now, on another matter, this morning's October inflation report tells a story that has become familiar on President Biden's watch. Prices remain stubbornly high and well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Prices are up 3.2% year over year, and cumulative inflation since the president took office now clocks in at 17.6%. Even as the rate prices are growing, Working Americans are growing more frustrated with an expensive new normal. The price of a gallon of milk has risen 15.8% since January of 2021. Meanwhile, a gallon of gas is going for 54.8% more. As one small business owner in Texas put it to reporters recently, he said, "I'm trying to think of one area where prices have eased, and I can't think of anything." Earlier this month, President Biden told a gathering in rural Minnesota that, quote, "Bidenomics is just another way of saying the American dream." American people are just simply not buying that. According to one recent survey, only 14% of U.S. voters have said President Biden has made them better off, and 65% of voters said they had cut back on non-essential spending. So if the president thinks that Bidenomics is the American dream, he might want to pay closer attention to how many Americans are desperate to wake up. Now, on one final matter, 1 year ago, President Biden met for the first time with President Xi, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and he pledged that the United States would compete vigorously with the PRC. 1 year later, the president and the chairman will meet again today. So let's take stock of whether the Biden administration is living up to its pledge of vigorous competition. The stakes of this competition simply cannot be overstated. The Chinese military is outpacing us in pivotal military capabilities like hypersonics, precise long-range fires, and even naval vessels. Beijing has secured a commanding share of the rare minerals necessary to create critical supply. Chinese agents are engaged in an aggressive effort to steal sensitive Western technologies and government secrets, and the PRC consistently signals its disdain for national sovereignty, human rights, and the free flow of commerce. In other words, strategic competition with China is going to determine the course of the next century of American history. And yet, the Biden administration has too often met this historic moment with weakness and naivete, time and time again, and has sacrificed competition on the altar of green climate policy. In the administration's quest to turn the American automobile industry electric, it has apparently made peace with sending American tax dollars to the Chinese industries that dominate battery-making input. In pursuit of grand climate diplomacy, the administration's envoys have been literally laughed out of Beijing by a state that keeps on increasing its carbon emissions and has no plan to start cutting them literally for years. And meanwhile, the consequences of the Biden administration's neglect for American hard power are only getting more dangerous. The PRC is acquiring new weapons as much as 6 times faster than the United States, and for each of the past 2 years, it announced a 7% increase in military spending. But even as the president's national defense strategy identifies China as the pacing threat, his defense budget requests haven't even kept up with inflation. Chairman Xi has gone out of his way to align closely with fellow adversaries of the West, stepping up joint military exercises with Putin's forces and helping both Moscow and Tehran endure Western sanctions. China has made military competition with the West a top priority. We can't afford to ignore this challenge. Our allies certainly aren't. Japan, South Korea, and Australia and other Indo-Pacific parties are investing heavily in their own defense. Taiwan is seeking to make itself a harder target for Chinese aggression, but America must continue to do its part. We have to keep investing in the sort of defense industrial base that can sustain this armament and strengthen our own military for effective deterrence. The Senate has multiple opportunities before us in both supplemental measures and full-year defense appropriations to do exactly that. And we can't afford not to seize these opportunities.